The banker's pen stopped moving halfway through the signature line. He looked up at Alan Petrowski across the desk, then down at the purchase agreement again. $347,000. Cash purchase. Hutchinson Implement Company. Every building, every piece of inventory, every service bay, every parts bin, and the John Deere franchise itself. The buyer was a farmer from 10 miles outside town. The seller was the buyer's first cousin. Alan, the banker said quietly, are you absolutely sure about this? Alan Petrowski didn't answer right away. He was looking at the empty signature line, where his cousin Rick's name would go. Rick Henning, the man who'd told him no 6 weeks earlier. The man who'd laughed at him in front of 3 other customers when Alan walked into the dealership and asked to order 6 new tractors for immediate delivery. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Alan said. The banker finished signing. It was October 14th, 1988. By the end of the day, Alan Petrowski would own the only John Deere dealership in McLeod County, Minnesota, and his cousin Rick would be out of business. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something about what I'm going to share. This story is built on documented realities from 1988, a year when land prices had finally bottomed after 7 years of collapse, when the farmers who'd survived were starting to see opportunities, and when agricultural equipment dealers were failing at rates that rivaled the farms themselves. According to industry reports, over 200 John Deere dealerships closed or were consolidated between 1981 and 1989. The financial strategies, the equipment specifications, and the family tensions you're about to hear are drawn from interviews with farmers and dealers who lived through this exact situation. I've combined details from multiple real cases, but every number, every piece of machinery, and every business decision reflects what actually happened across the rural Midwest in the final years of the farm crisis. If you know what it was like to watch a family business collapse, or if you were the one who made different choices and survived while others didn't, this story might hit close. The comment section is open. I want to hear from you. Now, let me take you back to where this really started. Not in 1988, but 23 years earlier. Alan Petrowski and Rick Henning were born 3 months apart in 1952. Their mothers were sisters. Their fathers farmed adjoining sections in McLeod County. The Petrowski place to the east, the Henning place to the west. Growing up, the 2 boys were inseparable. They showed 4-H calves together, played on the same baseball team, learned to drive tractors on the same John Deere 4020. But they never really understood each other. Rick was the one who always had the newest gear, newest baseball glove, newest shotgun. When he turned 16, his father bought him a 3-year-old Chevy pickup. Rick wrecked it 6 months later and got a newer one. When he graduated high school in 1970, his father sent him to the University of Minnesota, not to study agriculture, to study business. Rick came back 2 years later with ideas about expansion, modernization, and leveraging opportunities. Alan never went to college. He worked the home place with his father, saved every dollar he could, and married a schoolteacher named Janet in 1974. Janet kept teaching. Her paycheck went straight into savings. In 1976, Rick's father bought the John Deere dealership in Hutchinson. He was tired of farming, he said, tired of weather and markets and uncertainty. The dealership was steady income. Rick was 24 years old when his father handed him the keys and told him it was his to run. Rick renamed it Hutchinson Implement Company and started ordering inventory, like Deere was going to stop making tractors tomorrow. That same year, Alan's father had a heart attack during harvest. He survived, but he couldn't farm anymore. Alan took over the family operation, 320 acres, all paid for. No debt. His father had made the last payment in 1968. You need to expand, Rick told him at Thanksgiving that year. 320 acres? Alan, that's nothing. You should be farming 1,000. 2,000. Land's cheap. Interest rates are low. I can get you a deal on equipment. Alan said no. He didn't need to expand. 320 was enough. Rick thought that was the most pathetic thing he'd ever heard. The late 70s were good years for Rick. The dealership was selling tractors faster than Deere could ship them. Farmers were buying everything: new equipment, used equipment, parts, service. In 1978, Rick added a second building. In 1979, he added a third. He hired 8 mechanics, 3 salesmen, and a full-time parts manager. He bought a new house in Hutchinson, a lake cabin near Brainerd, and a boat that cost more than most people's cars. Allen was still farming 320, still driving a 1967 Ford pickup, still living in the farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1931. But he had no debt, and Janet was still teaching. Then 1980 happened. You probably know what I'm talking about. Interest rates exploded. The prime rate hit 21.5% by December. Grain prices started falling. Land prices kept climbing for another year. But everyone could feel something breaking underneath. Rick didn't slow down. He'd always operated on credit. That's how dealerships worked. You borrowed to buy inventory, sold the inventory, paid back the loan, borrowed again. The cycle worked as long as farmers kept buying. In 1981, they stopped buying. Rick's inventory sat. The floor plan payments came due anyway. He borrowed more to cover them. Allen watched all this from 10 miles away. He didn't expand. He didn't buy new equipment. In 1982, when land prices started dropping, he didn't sell. He just kept farming 320, kept his costs low, and watched the storm roll in. By 1984, Rick's dealership was in trouble. Not failing yet, but stressed. Too much inventory nobody wanted. Too much credit extended to farmers who couldn't pay. The manufacturers were offering special financing to move equipment, but it was cutting margins to nothing. Rick's bankers started asking questions. At family gatherings, Rick stopped talking about expansion. He talked about how tough the equipment business had gotten, how farmers didn't appreciate quality anymore, how everyone wanted deals nobody could afford to give them. Allen mostly stayed quiet. In 1985, Rick's banker made him consolidate loans, cut inventory, let 2 mechanics go. Rick fought it, but he did it. The dealership survived. Barely. Allen's operation, meanwhile, was fine. 320 paid for. Equipment old but functional. No debt except a small operating loan each spring that he paid off every fall. And Janet's teaching salary still covering their living expenses. They weren't getting rich, but they weren't drowning either. Now here's what you need to understand about 1985 through 1987 in rural Minnesota. Land values collapsed. According to USDA data, Minnesota farmland lost 40% of its peak value. Farmers who bought at the top or borrowed against inflated values were underwater. Foreclosures were constant. But the flip side of that disaster was opportunity. If you had cash, Allen started buying land in 1986. Not much. 80 acres here. A quarter section there. Land nobody else wanted because nobody else could get financing. He paid cash. Prices were so low he could afford it from 10 years of savings. By 1988, Allen was farming 960 acres. All paid for. No debt. Rick knew about this. The whole county knew. But Rick never asked Allen how he'd done it. Pride wouldn't let him. The drought of 1988 was severe. You might remember it if you were farming then. Across the Midwest, corn yields dropped by 40% in some areas. Soybeans weren't much better. But something else happened in 1988. Prices rallied. The drought was bad enough that export buyers got nervous. Corn jumped to $3 a bushel. Soybeans hit $9. If you had grain to sell, you made money that year. Allen had grain. His land was paid for, so he could afford a store from the previous year. He sold at the peak. That fall, he cleared more profit than he'd made in the previous 3 years combined, and he decided he needed more equipment. This is where we get to the scene I opened with. But let me set it up properly. Allen walked into Hutchinson Implement on September 22nd, 1988. It was a Thursday morning. The dealership lot was half empty, not because they'd sold equipment, but because they didn't have much to sell. Rick was in his office. 3 other customers were looking at a used combine. Allen found Rick and told him what he wanted. 6 new tractors, 2 John Deere 4650s, 3 4450s, 1 4850, all with front wheel assist, all with cab air conditioning. all to be delivered within 60 days, so he could take advantage of year-end financing terms. Rick stared at him. 6 tractors? That's right. Alan, you farm 900 acres. Why do you need 6 tractors? That's my business. Rick looked at the other customers, then back at Alan, and he laughed. Not a friendly laugh, a dismissive laugh. Alan, I don't think you understand how this works. I can't just order 6 tractors on speculation. These aren't bicycles. Each one of those is $60,000. I need deposits. I need credit applications. I'm paying cash, Alan said. The other customers stopped talking. Rick's expression changed. Cash. I'll write you a check today for the full amount if you can guarantee delivery. Rick sat back in his chair. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he shook his head. I can't do it. Why not? Because I don't have that kind of inventory capacity right now. And because Rick paused. Because I don't believe you have that kind of cash. Alan felt something cold settle in his chest. You calling me a liar? I'm saying I'd need to verify funds before I committed to an order that size. Then verify them. It would take time. How much time? A week. Maybe more. And honestly, Alan, even if the money's there, I'm not sure I want to tie up that much floor plan credit for one customer. Especially one who's never bought new equipment from me before. The other customers were openly staring now. Alan stood up. He didn't raise his voice. Okay. He walked out. He sat in his pickup in the parking lot for 10 minutes. Then he drove to First National Bank and asked to see the president. The president's name was George Lindahl. He'd known Alan since Alan was a kid. George, Alan said, I want to know something. If I wanted to buy Hutchinson Implement, could you finance it? George blinked. Buy it. The whole dealership. Buildings, inventory, franchise, everything. Is it for sale? It might be. George leaned back in his chair. Alan, what's going on? Alan told him. The whole story. The refusal. The humiliation in front of other customers. The years of watching Rick operate on credit and arrogance while Alan built slowly and carefully. Here's what I know, Alan said. Rick is overextended. His inventory's aged. His floor plan is maxed. He's behind on property taxes. I checked at the county assessor's office this morning, and I know John Deere's been quietly pushing consolidation among dealers. They want fewer, stronger franchises. George didn't disagree with any of that. I've got cash, Alan continued. I've got land equity. I've got no debt. If Rick would sell, I could run that dealership better than he does, and I could still farm. Why would Rick sell? Because in about 6 months, he won't have a choice. George studied him for a long time. Then he opened a file cabinet and pulled out a folder. I'm going to tell you something that stays between us. Rick's dealership has been on our watch list for 2 years. He's current on his loans, but barely. He restructured twice. If he has a bad winter. George didn't finish the sentence. So could you finance it? Alan asked. If the price was right. Yes. But Alan, buying a dealership is different from farming. It's daily cash flow management. It's inventory turns. It's warranty work and customer complaints and parts back orders. Are you sure you want that? I'm sure I don't want Rick telling me no when I have cash in hand. George nodded slowly. Give me a few days. Let me make some calls. 3 weeks later, Rick's banker called Rick into his office. Not George. Rick banked at a different institution, but George had made calls. Quiet calls. To John Deere Corporate. To other bankers. To equipment dealers in adjacent counties. Rick's banker told him the truth. The dealership was undercapitalized. The floor plan was unsustainable. Deere was looking at franchise consolidation. If Rick wanted to get out before he was forced out, now was the time. Rick sat there feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. Who told you this? Multiple sources. Did my cousin put you up to this? The banker didn't answer that directly. There's been an offer. It's a fair offer. More than fair, given current market conditions. $350,000 for everything. The buyer has verified funds. Rick knew instantly who the buyer was. He called Alan that night. Janet answered. Alan was out feeding cattle. When he came in, Janet told him Rick had called. Alan didn't call back. Rick called again the next morning. And the next. On the fourth call, Alan answered. You're trying to steal my business, Rick said. I made a fair offer through proper channels. You humiliated me. No, Alan said. You humiliated yourself when you laughed at me in front of customers and told me you didn't believe I had money. You've been treating me like I'm an idiot for 20 years, Rick. Like farming 320 acres made me some kind of failure. Like not going into debt made me a coward. Well, I'm not the one who's losing his business. There was silence on the line. The offer's $347 after I negotiated down property tax adjustments. Alan continued. It's good for 30 days. After that, Deere's going to start looking at relocating the franchise anyway. Your banker knows it. You know it. So you can take my offer, or you can wait 6 months and take nothing. Rick hung up. 2 weeks later, Rick signed. The closing was October 14th, 1988. Rick didn't show up in person. He sent his lawyer with the signed documents. Alan sat across from Rick's banker and the title company representative and signed his name 19 times. When it was done, he owned Hutchinson Implement Company. He renamed it Petrowski Equipment the following week. The community response was complicated. Some people thought Alan was a vulture, taking advantage of family, kicking a man when he was down. Others thought Rick had it coming, that he'd operated on arrogance and credit for too long, and finally met someone who'd operated on discipline and cash. The farmers who'd been refused credit or service by Rick's dealership during the tight years, and there were several, started showing up at Alan's place almost immediately. The mechanics Rick had laid off in '85 came back. Alan hired all of them. The parts manager stayed. Alan gave him a raise. Rick left town, moved to the Twin Cities. Last I heard, he was selling insurance. He and Alan haven't spoken since the closing. Alan ran the dealership for 11 years. He sold it in 1999 to a regional agricultural equipment company for just under $2 million. He kept farming. He's still farming today. Over 2,000 acres now, most of it bought during the crisis at bottom prices. Here's what I want you to understand about this story, because it's easy to make Alan a hero and Rick the villain, and that's too simple. Rick wasn't a bad businessman because he was reckless. He was operating the way most dealerships operated in the late 70s, on credit, on expansion, on the assumption that growth would continue. That model worked until it didn't. When the crisis hit, Rick was exposed. He couldn't adapt fast enough. Alan wasn't a genius. He was conservative, sometimes painfully conservative. If the crisis hadn't happened, Rick would probably still own that dealership, and Alan would still be farming 320. Alan's strategy worked because the crisis happened. He survived by being cautious, while others failed by being aggressive. But here's the deeper lesson, and it's one that's still relevant today when farmers face decisions about $250,000 combines and dealerships face decisions about inventory and credit. Alan understood something fundamental about leverage. Not financial leverage, emotional leverage. He knew Rick thought he was smarter than Alan. He knew Rick had always thought Alan's conservative approach was weakness. And he knew that when the opportunity came, Rick wouldn't be able to see him as a legitimate buyer, because Rick had spent 20 years seeing him as a lesser version of himself. That blind spot cost Rick his business. When Alan walked into that dealership and asked for 6 tractors, he was testing something. He was testing whether Rick could set aside family history and pride and see a legitimate customer with legitimate cash. Rick failed that test. If Rick had said yes, filled that order, treated Alan with basic respect, none of the rest would have happened. Alan would have bought his tractors and left. But Rick laughed at him. The 6 tractors? Alan bought them eventually. 3 from a dealership in Glencoe. 2 from a dealer in Hutchinson after Alan owned the place. 1 from an auction in Iowa. He still has 2 of them. Both 4650s. Both with over 15,000 hours now. Both still running. Here's something else I want you to think about. In 1988, Minnesota had 63 John Deere dealerships. Today there are 28. Consolidation happened. It was inevitable. The question was never whether small dealerships would survive. It was who would own the ones that did. Rick thought he would. Alan knew better. According to dealership industry analyses from the late 80s, the average John Deere dealer in the Midwest was carrying inventory worth 2.5 times their annual sales. That's how floor plan financing worked. But when sales dropped 70% during the crisis, that inventory became an anchor. Dealers couldn't liquidate it without taking massive losses. They couldn't afford to keep it without bleeding on floor plan interest. The ones who survived were the ones who cut deep, held cash, and waited for the bottom. Alan waited for the bottom. Then he bought it. I've talked to 3 other people who did similar things in the late 80s. Farmers who bought equipment dealerships, feed stores, small-town banks, even other farms. They all say the same thing. It wasn't about being predatory. It was about being positioned. If you'd managed to survive with cash and no debt, opportunities appeared that would never come again. Some people can't forgive that. They see someone buy a neighbor's foreclosed land or a relative's failed business, and they see exploitation. Maybe sometimes it is. But sometimes it's just what happens when one person makes different choices and positions themselves differently. Alan didn't cause Rick's problems. The crisis caused Rick's problems. Alan just refused to join him in them. There's one more piece to this story. In 1995, when Alan had been running the dealership for 7 years, Rick came back to Hutchinson for a wedding. Mutual cousin. They ended up at the same table at the reception. Janet told me about this later. She said the 2 of them sat there for 20 minutes without speaking, while everyone else at the table tried to make conversation. Then Rick finally looked at Alan and said, "You could have offered to help me instead of taking it." Alan didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You never asked." Rick said, "You never offered." Alan said, "When exactly would you have listened? When you were buying your lake cabin. When you were buying your 3rd building. When you were laughing at me in front of customers. You didn't want my help. Rick, you wanted me to fail so you could feel better about your choices." Rick left shortly after that. Janet says Alan sat there for a long time after Rick was gone. She asked him if he felt bad about what happened. Alan told her no. He didn't feel bad, but he didn't feel good either. He felt like he'd won a fight he never wanted to have in the first place. That's probably the most honest answer anyone could give about what it was like to survive the 1980s. Nobody won. Some people just lost less than others. If you made it through that decade, if you were the one who held on while neighbors didn't, or if you were the one who didn't make it and watched others take what you built, I want to hear from you, because these stories matter, not as morality tales, not as hero stories, just as history, as what happened, the complicated, bitter, human history of rural America breaking and some people surviving the break. Alan Petrowski bought 6 tractors and ended up buying the dealership. That's what the title says. That's what happened. But the real story is about pride and humiliation, and the ways family can wound deeper than strangers ever could. The real story is about 2 boys who grew up together and took different paths, and only one of them made it through. And the one who made it through still lives 10 miles outside Hutchinson, still farms, still remembers the look on his cousin's face when he laughed at him. Some victories cost more than losses. If this kind of storytelling matters to you, if you think these pieces of agricultural history deserve to be preserved, not as legends but as truth, then subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. The algorithm doesn't care about stories like this, but you might. And if you've got a story like this, a moment when a crisis made you choose between family and survival, or when opportunity came wrapped in someone else's catastrophe, put it in the comments. I'm listening, because we're still trying to understand what happened to us out there. Still trying to figure out what we became in order to survive. And sometimes the only way to understand it is to tell it.